Moscow, January 23, 1991. Dawn's just breaking as Sergei, a machinist, waits outside the bank, gripping three 100-ruble bills that, as of last night's TV broadcast, might as well be play money. Across the courtyard, his neighbor Nina slips past the growing line. No drama, just quiet confidence. Because, unlike Sergei, her real nest egg isn't stuffed into paper notes at all. By Friday, Sergei discovers his month's wage has basically vanished in a 3-day exchange rush. Nina, on the other hand, she's still cooking, still bargaining, still keeping her cool. Was it luck? Not really. Connections? Nope. The real secret goes back farther than the entire Soviet experiment. What's wild is that this story isn't really about the USSR alone. Back in January 91, when Soviet authorities rolled out the so-called Pavlov Reform, people got 3 measly days to swap out their 50 and 100 ruble bills, a cap at 1,000 rubles each, roughly the average monthly salary. The government wanted to pull in 30 billion rubles, but barely got 14 billion. Funny how these things play out, isn't it? You see the same blueprint again and again. Weimar Germany in the early 20s, Argentina in 2001, Yugoslavia in the 90s. Most folks pour their energy into propping up the currency itself, while a quieter group moves to protect what that money was supposed to mean in the first place. Dig through thousands of years of monetary chaos. Yep, that long. And there's a clear pattern. Whenever trust collapses faster than prices can keep up, 5 kinds of assets show up in every survivor's toolkit. Not investments like we talk about on Wall Street. These are more like civilizational assets. The things that still matter when everything else is up in the air. What might surprise you, in the Soviet collapse, bank accounts sometimes weathered the storm better than cash. Even then, the real winners rarely relied on either for their main protection. So, what did they know that everyone else missed? Most people would bet the farm that the best survival tool is financial. Strangely enough, history doesn't back that up. Take 1991. When the ruble went haywire, one of the sneakiest shields Soviet families had was a tiny garden at the dacha. These weren't wealthy people, just folks with a patch of potatoes, some onions and cabbage, and jars of pickled veggies. It wasn't luxury. It was insulation from the worst food shocks. While city dwellers watched shelves empty out and prices go nuts, families with a bit of land could put their work straight into their stomachs. It's not a one-off either. The same thing popped up in Leningrad after the war, and then again in Cuba during the 90s, when urban agriculture helped soften the blow from both failing currency and supply chaos. Here's the key. Food doesn't lock in your buying power. It skips the whole money part when the system breaks down. So maybe things don't repeat exactly. They rarely do. But the rhyme is hard to ignore. Historians spot this over and over. Even a little productive land functions less like property and more like a personal lifeboat. Now, here's where most people really go sideways. Strange as it sounds, sometimes the safest money isn't money at all. During the Soviet collapse, families who stocked up on durable goods, tools, extra machine parts, a sewing machine, a spare generator, cans of fuel, or even an extra set of shoes were far better off than those clutching wads of rubles. That old wrench in the garage? Suddenly, it bought more than a month's salary. A factory electrician with some copper wire and his repair kit could swap his skills for food, bus fare, medicine, or even some help around the house. Meanwhile, the person with neatly stacked rubles faced an ever-shifting mess. Empty shelves and prices that made no sense. It happened after World War II in Germany, too. Cigarettes were money for a while. And again in Argentina's barter markets, where household goods and fixer-upper skills turned into the new cash. When you look back at what actually gets people through a currency meltdown, there's a rule that keeps coming up. Physical goods don't just beat inflation. They start acting as money itself when the official kind stops delivering what folks actually need. Strange, but that's the part everyone underestimates. These days, the signals aren't so much screaming emergency as quietly hinting at deep-rooted weakness. When supplies are tight, things that last, durable goods, suddenly matter more. long before their prices really reflect that shift. But let's talk about something people barely mention. In the Soviet Union, the most powerful survival tool wasn't necessarily obvious. It wasn't a physical thing at all. It was the sort of skill you could use outside of your regular job. When rubles stopped holding any real value, folks like plumbers, mechanics, English tutors, seamstresses, and dentists could still name their own price. Why? Because they fixed problems that couldn't wait, problems every family faced. On the other hand, a government clerk who saved up a tidy sum but didn't have a practical side gig, they watched their nest egg melt away. Meanwhile, the guy who fixed refrigerators could almost always find a meal. You see this pattern again and again. Weimar Germany? Craftsmen adjusted their prices every single day. Venezuela's inflation collapse? Electricians and mobile phone fixers held onto value way longer than office workers could. Here's the big takeaway. Skills aren't like money you save under your mattress. They're more like a machine that prints value whenever savings lose meaning. Just sit with that idea for a second. Of course, none of this is meant as investment advice. If you're making important moves, always talk to someone who knows your situation inside and out. Looking back, historians can see the real pattern clear as day. Niche, hands-on, and locally needed skills have outperformed vague promises of future security again and again. But honestly, the survival asset that got all the attention wasn't the one that mattered most. If you dig through historical records, you'll notice something eerie. In every meltdown, trust becomes a kind of currency. In late Soviet cities, life ran on a web of informal favors. People relied on neighbors, rural relatives, friends with warehouse connections, someone who knew a mechanic or a sympathetic doctor. It's striking. Two families might bring home the same salary on paper. One still went hungry, while the other seemed to always find flour, medicine, a train ticket, or someone to watch the kids. Why? The difference was in the strength of their networks. Again, you spot this in other times and places. Roman Egypt during grain shortages. Lebanon during the banking fiasco. Family links and the diaspora's help often proved more valuable than money stuck in a failing bank. It keeps coming back to this. Money's nice until the system around it fails. When that happens, trust and connections find a way around the blockage. Think about that. Let it really land. Whether or not today matches those old crises, the data keeps showing that social capital, a dense web of relationships and favors, might be the most underrated resource out there. Now, here's the deepest layer. There's a common myth that the ruble collapse dragged everyone down the same way, but that's not quite how it played out. Some Soviets had an escape hatch, foreign currency, goods they could trade abroad, or relatives living outside the ruble zone. They had options that nobody else did. Picture a Baltic sailor with a little stash of US dollars, or a family who received Deutsche Marks every so often from their relatives in the West. Even musicians getting paid in imported goods by foreign guests. Sure, life was still tough, but these folks had a backup system for value. You see this same move during Zimbabwe's dollarization or Argentina's habit of stashing dollars under the mattress. Here's the trick. Outside assets, something the local system doesn't control, don't predict collapse. They just give you another way out when your usual options stop working. Simple sentence, huge point. And honestly, none of us are immune to this kind of risk. In the end, today's warning light isn't really about one currency or another. It's about understanding that spreading your bets, not just across investments, but across entire systems, has always been a big deal in times of crisis. So what bound all those survivor types together? It wasn't that they were super geniuses or had insider information or even political strings to pull. What they had was something the system couldn't conjure up, freeze, ration away, or suddenly change the rules on. A patch of soil for vegetables, a set of tools, a learned, in-demand trade, a trustworthy web of relationships, a way to keep value beyond the reach of a collapsing currency. When you really look at it, each of these assets does one simple thing. It reduces your need to trust the system will fix things. That's the real lesson history keeps underlining. The Soviet who weathered the ruble's collapse? They weren't the ones with the fattest savings account. They were the people with the most ways to keep life running, money or no money. That's why this pattern pops up every few decades. Currency crashes don't create the problems. They just spotlight where the cracks have been hiding all along. Here's a bit of a mental twist for you. Broken systems don't hit everyone equally. They hurt people most who put all their resilience eggs in the system's basket. And that, in the end, might be the oldest financial lesson we've got. If you want to see these patterns before they're old news, stick around. This channel digs into historical forensics like this every week. Here's the punchline. The money usually collapses second. First, it's dependence that goes down.